Have you ever wondered what people did before toilet paper existed? Not just 100 years ago, but nearly 1,000 in the damp stone cottages of medieval Europe, where even a bath was a rare event and privacy was something only kings could afford. Tonight, we're traveling back to a quieter, dirtier, and strangely fascinating world, a world where moss, wool, hay, and even river stones replace the soft comforts we take for granted today. This isn't a story of disgust. It's a story of survival, of ordinary life lived close to the earth, where every small act, even something as simple as wiping, told a story about how people endured. So settle in, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's drift back to the Middle Ages to discover how life continued, one humble chamber pot at a time. Life without toilet paper. Medieval hygiene explained. If you were to close your eyes and wake up in a small medieval village somewhere in England, France, or perhaps the Germanic countryside, the first thing you'd notice wouldn't be the sound of horses or the sight of castle towers. It would be the smell. The faint, earthy, unwashed smell of human life before soap was common, before linen was changed daily, and long before the idea of toilet paper drifted across the imagination of Europe. The people of the Middle Ages lived in a world where cleanliness meant something very different from what you know today. Bathing was not a daily act of refreshment, but a rare ritual. And when nature called, when the body reminded its owner that food, after all, must also leave the tools for tending to that moment, were as practical as they were varied. Stones, moss, hay, wool scraps, even bare hands. The details are not glamorous, but they are true. And they are, in their own strange way, a quiet window into how people endured the realities of life long before modern comforts. Let's step softly into that world for a while. Imagine a small cottage. Its walls built from wattle and daub branches woven together, plastered with a mixture of straw and mud. The hearth is the center of the home, warm but smoky, filling the air with the scent of ash and stewed barley. There's no separate bathroom. There is, instead, a chamber pot made of clay, sometimes metal if the family was fortunate. The pot is used at night or during cold mornings, emptied into a pit or the street come daylight. When someone used the chamber pot, there were choices to be made afterward, choices shaped by class, geography, and season. The wealthy, those who lived in manors or within the castle walls, might have bits of cloth, old linen rags that had seen their final days of usefulness. Cloth was precious, spun and woven by hand, so it wasn't wasted easily. But when a tunic tore or a chemise became too thin to mend, it could be cut into strips for household use, including hygiene. Most people, though, lived far from such luxury. In the countryside, nature offered its own resources. Soft moss gathered from shaded stones, smooth river pebbles warmed by the sun, handfuls of hay, or clusters of lamb's wool were common solutions. In coastal towns, some even used seashells, though the idea sounds more painful than practical. And in regions of northern Europe, where snow lingered through long winters, clean snow itself could be a temporary relief. The Roman Empire had once used sponges tied to sticks, rinsed in salt water or vinegar, a practice that survived in monasteries for centuries afterward. Some monks kept communal sponges in stone latrines built along running water channels, where the steady flow carried waste away. The system was crude but efficient, and in its quiet simplicity, it represented one of the few places in medieval Europe where sanitation was something close to organized. Outside monastery walls, however, most people lived with waste much more directly. Towns lacked proper sewers. Streets were narrow, lined with thatched roofs and timber beams that leaned inward like tired shoulders. Chamber pots were emptied into open gutters, and human waste mingled with animal droppings, rainwater, and the occasional discarded food. A passing traveler might walk through mud that was, in truth, something more unpleasant. Yet this was normal. It wasn't neglect, it was simply the way things were. The idea of germ theory, of invisible dangers lurking in filth, was centuries away. People believed disease came from bad air or moral decay, not from contaminated surfaces. Washing hands after using the toilet wasn't an expectation. It was an oddity. A person might rinse in cold water if it was nearby, or wipe their hands on straw or fabric. In a world where survival itself required constant effort, such habits were neither questioned nor refined. And so, through the centuries, the story of how people wiped becomes a story of how people lived, how they adapted, endured, and made sense of a messy world. In the great castles of Europe, the contrast was striking. Lords and ladies had garderobes, stone closets built into the walls, often extending outward over the moat. Waste fell through a chute into the water or into pits below. Garderobes sometimes doubled as storage for fine clothing, under the belief that the ammonia rising from waste kept away moths. Imagine that for a moment. Silken garments hanging in a room just above a latrine, perfumed faintly by the scent of humanity and decay. The seat in such a garderobe was usually a wooden plank with a hole cut through. There were no toilet rolls, no privacy screens, no perfumed soap waiting nearby. Just the cold stone, the drafty air, and perhaps a handful of straw. If the resident was of noble rank, a servant often called a groom of the stool might assist, bringing cloths or basins of water. This position, strange as it sounds, was one of trust and even intimacy. The groom was privy to the lord's most private moments, and in some royal courts, it became a role of political importance. To clean a king's backside was to stand closer to power than many knights ever would. Down below, in the kitchens and stables, common servants had none of that privilege. They used whatever the day offered. The hay meant for animals became a tool of hygiene. In rural farms, dried corn cobs, especially in later centuries, served the same purpose. It was not elegant, but it was enough across the sea. In Islamic cities like Baghdad or Cordoba, hygiene took a different path. There, the ritual act of cleanliness was woven into daily religious life. Water was always preferred over wiping. Even the simplest homes had clay jugs or small pitchers for washing after defecation, an early form of what the world would now recognize as a bidet. In many ways, the Islamic world was centuries ahead of Europe in understanding sanitation. Their streets were washed, their public baths abundant, and their hygiene deeply tied to spirituality. But in the Christian West, bathing often carried suspicion. Church leaders warned that too much attention to the body could invite vanity or sin. Some saints went years without washing as acts of piety. Saint Agnes was said to have gone a lifetime without bathing, while others believed dirt was a shield against temptation. This religious view, combined with the scarcity of resources, made cleanliness rare. And so, when one could not cleanse, one simply adapted. The rhythm of medieval life revolved around dirt, and people accepted it the way we accept weather, an inconvenience beyond control. The sense of sweat, smoke, and soil filled every hall and hut. Clothing absorbed it. Walls soaked it in. Even so, the people of that world didn't see themselves as unclean. They saw themselves as ordinary at the end of the day. When darkness crept across the fields and fires burned low, families used chamber pots before sleep. Children squirmed, parents scolded, and the pot was placed discreetly in a corner until morning. The idea of walking outside in the cold night to a pit latrine wasn't appealing. And so, even in modest homes, that small clay vessel became as essential as the hearth itself. The morning after, someone, usually the woman of the house or a servant, would carry the pot to the midden heap or the street gutter. In towns, night soil men, or gong farmers, collected waste and transported it away in carts, often to be used as fertilizer. Their job was dangerous and foul. The fumes of decay could suffocate a man, and the pay was meager. But they performed a service without which medieval towns would have drowned in their own filth. It's easy, from the comfort of modern plumbing, to look back with a shudder. But perhaps it's more interesting to see it as part of human endurance, the quiet, unspoken resilience of ordinary life. Every scrape of moss, every rinsed sponge, every pot emptied before dawn was an act of adaptation, of living with what was available, even among nobles. The experience wasn't so different. Queen Elizabeth I of England, centuries after the Middle Ages, reportedly refused to bathe more than once a month. The royal court smelled of perfume and sweat, of wine and wool, of bodies covered in brocade, but never quite clean. And still, people carried on. It wasn't until the late Renaissance that paper began to find its way into the process. In China, centuries earlier, people had already been using paper for hygiene. By the 14th century, official records from the Ming Dynasty mention large-scale production of hygienic paper for the imperial family. But in Europe, paper was far too expensive. It was for scribes, for letters, for books that took months to copy. To use it for wiping would have seemed wasteful, even absurd. So the habits persisted. When one thinks of medieval hygiene, it's not just about what was used to wipe, but how people understood their relationship with their own bodies. To them, survival was the priority. Cleanliness was comfort, not necessity. And modesty, especially for women, shaped much of how hygiene was handled. Medieval women faced particular challenges. Layers of heavy skirts, long chemises, and limited privacy meant that relieving oneself required patience and discretion. Some women used small handheld urinals made of brass or ceramic, called burdaloos in later centuries. These allowed them to relieve themselves without fully undressing, especially during long journeys or church services. For wiping, they might keep a small piece of linen tucked discreetly under their garments, washed and reused when possible. In colder months, wool or moss served the same purpose. In monasteries, where silence and order ruled, latrines were built with careful thought. Rows of stone seats over running water channels allowed multiple monks to relieve themselves in quiet, side by side, robes pooling around their feet. No words were spoken. Only the sound of flowing water and the occasional creak of wood echoed through the stone chamber. It was a strange blend of humility and practicality, a reminder that even the most devout lives were tethered to the same earthly needs. The medieval world was full of smells, but those smells told stories. The scent of herbs drying from the rafters spoke of medicine and preservation. The smoke from the hearth told of meals and warmth. And yes, the less pleasant odors spoke of bodies and life, of a world that had not yet hidden its natural processes behind tiled walls and porcelain bowls. It's almost poetic, in a way, the rawness of it. A time when humanity still lived close to its own biology, unfiltered and unrefined. There were no air fresheners, no running water, no soft rolls of tissue. Just people, adapting day by day in a rhythm of necessity. If you were to walk through a medieval street at dawn, you might see a maid tossing the contents of a chamber pot into the gutter, calling out, "Gardes low," a warning for anyone passing below. You might see a monk drawing water from a well, or a farmer carrying straw to the privy behind his cottage. The scene would seem humble, even primitive. But it was also the foundation of everything that came later. Every improvement in plumbing, every innovation in sanitation, grew from those simple, unremarkable acts. And so, when you think about medieval people living without toilet paper, it's not just about what they lacked. It's about how they managed, how they carried on with grace and practicality, how they made a world out of very little. There's a strange comfort in knowing that even without modern conveniences, life went on just the same. Meals were cooked, children were raised, songs were sung, and each evening, someone still emptied the pot by the door. It's easy to laugh at the idea of wiping with straw or moss, but to them, it was no more absurd than the future's fascination with scented tissue rolls might seem to us. The world changes, but the body remains the same. The needs are ancient. The methods only temporary in the quiet of a medieval night. As the fire dimmed and the air grew still, people settled into sleep beneath wool blankets. The world outside smelled of earth and smoke and humanity. And in that simple, unwashed world, there was a rhythm steady, enduring, and strangely peaceful. The story of medieval hygiene isn't one of disgust. It's one of survival, of adaptation, and of living close to the elements. To live without toilet paper was to live as most of human history has lived, finding comfort in what the earth provided. So when you next turn on a faucet or reach for a soft roll of paper, perhaps think of the moss and the linen, the river stones and the cold water of the monastery stream. Think of the people who came before, who managed, who endured. They were not cleaner, but they were not lesser. They were simply human living through the ordinary, in all its unwashed honesty. And in that simplicity lies something quietly beautiful. And that was life without toilet paper. Simple, strange, and somehow still human. It's a quiet reminder that even in the roughest centuries, people always found a way to live with comfort, dignity, and a bit of creativity. If you've drifted off somewhere along the way, that's perfectly fine. That's what these stories are for. A gentle way to end your day with a little piece of forgotten history. But if you're still here, still listening, thank you for spending this quiet time with me. If you'd like more slow, sleepy journeys through the past, you can like this video, subscribe to Quiet Boring Sleep, and ring the little bell so you'll know when the next calm story arrives. Until then, sleep well, dream of simpler times, and remember, even history can be peaceful.